The moment my husband got a promotion that bumped his salary to $250,000 a year, my mother-in-law immediately pressured me to divorce him. I was about to make a scene when my husband whispered, "Just pretend to agree." I listened to him. A month later, I finally saw how brilliant he truly was. That evening, I stood in our family's small kitchen, arranging plates of lemon herb baked salmon on the granite counter, my heart filled with both joy and nervous anticipation. Today was a very special day. My husband, David, had just been appointed as the head of new product development at Pure Harvest Corp., which meant his salary was bumping up to nearly $250,000 a year, plus stock options. To many, that might just be a number, but to us, it was the result of 7 years of extreme frugality, endurance, and navigating countless financial hardships together. I still remember our early years of marriage when David was laid off for nearly 6 months. There were days when we were practically surviving on ramen and credit cards, yet I still managed to cook a decent meal, smiling as I told him that as long as we loved each other, we could always bounce back. From the day he joined Pure Harvest, I knew how hard he had worked. The company specialized in sustainable organic foods and had grown rapidly. This time, David was put in charge of a brand new product line. I heard it was a strategic project that could help Pure Harvest completely obliterate its competitors. He told me very little because the research documents and core formulas were highly classified. But one night, as we sat out on the backyard deck, he lowered his voice and said, "Hannah, corporate security is tightening things up right now. It looks like someone is trying to leak the formulas." Hearing this, I was both thrilled and worried. I was happy that my husband's talents were finally being recognized, but worried because I understood that the higher you climb the corporate ladder, the bigger target you become. I only told him one thing. More money is good. A higher position is great, but you must protect your integrity. A ruined reputation in this industry can never be bought back. David looked at me, smiled tiredly, and nodded. He knew that as long as I believed in him, that was enough. Yet, I never expected that the first person to change upon hearing of his promotion would not be some corporate rival, but my own mother-in-law, Brenda. I had been up since the afternoon preparing dinner. Lemon herb baked salmon, creamy mushroom soup, garlic roasted asparagus, and a specialty cake I had pre-ordered from a local bakery. I even carefully placed a vase of yellow daisies on the table, hoping the whole family could enjoy a celebratory meal together. It was almost 8 o'clock when David finally came home. He walked in carrying a corporate gift bag. His dress shirt was slightly wrinkled, and his face showed clear signs of exhaustion. But when he saw the dinner table, he still managed to smile. "You made a feast today." I smiled gently, welcoming the new director of our house. But before he could reply, my mother-in-law stepped out of the living room. She was wearing a dark purple silk blouse, a heavy Cartier necklace resting on her chest, and her eyes lit up as she looked at David. She pulled out a chair, sat down, glanced at the gift bag in her son's hand, and gave a half smile. "Your life has truly leveled up." I thought she was just happy for my husband, but immediately after, she shot me a glare as cold as ice. "The only problem is, a girl like her walking next to you now is a bit of a mismatch." The entire dining table fell dead silent. The soup ladle in my hand froze in midair. David furrowed his brows and looked at his mother. "What do you mean by that?" Brenda did not avoid his gaze. She picked up a piece of salmon, ate it slowly, and said, "Am I wrong? You're a senior executive now. You go to galas, meet CEOs, and venture capitalists. You're making $250,000 a year, and soon you'll get massive bonuses and stock options. And your wife? All year round, all she knows is the kitchen, cooking, and clipping coupons. Walking next to you at a country club event, it would be a miracle if people didn't laugh." Every word she spoke made my throat tighten. For 7 years, I never thought that putting my own ambitions on hold so my husband could focus on his career would one day be used as an excuse to humiliate me. The day he had nothing, I sold the vintage diamond earrings my grandmother left me and drained my 401 to help pay off his startup debts. The year my mother-in-law was recovering from a mild stroke, I was the one driving her to rehab, managing her home care, and acting as her full-time nurse. And now, just because my husband got a promotion, I was suddenly out of his league. Brenda grew more aggressive as she spoke. She talked about how her friend's son recently married a wealthy woman from a prominent family who came with a trust fund, a luxury SUV, and angel investments for his startup. Then she put her fork down and stared directly into my face. When a man moves up, he needs a wife who looks the part. If he keeps dragging along someone who can't elevate his status, he'll eventually fall behind. David slammed his glass onto the table. Mom, that's enough. But Brenda only sneered. You might be blind out of love, but I'm not. I've lived long enough to know how the real world works. Saying that, she stood up, walked into her bedroom, and came back a moment later. She slammed a stack of papers onto the glass table right in front of me. That dry, sharp sound made my heart drop to the bottom of my stomach. I looked down at the bold words at the top of the page. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Brenda crossed her arms, her voice utterly cold. Sign it. You're still young. Take a little alimony and find your own way. Don't wait until David climbs even higher and you get dumped in a much uglier public divorce. I looked up at my husband. David was looking at me too. His eyes had darkened, and his hand, hidden under the table, was clenched into a tight fist. As for me, in that moment, the celebratory dinner sitting in front of me suddenly felt bone-chillingly cold. I stared at the divorce papers. The black ink on the white paper was cruelly clear. It was as if they had not just prepared a document, but a fully paved road to kick me out of this house. My hands trembled. The fork slipped from my fingers and almost hit the hardwood floor. I always thought I could endure many things, but I never imagined my mother-in-law would slide divorce papers in front of me right at my husband's promotion dinner. What sent a colder shiver down my spine was the secondary document attached underneath, clearly outlining a post-divorce settlement of $50,000. $50,000. So, in Brenda's eyes, my 7 years of youth, 7 years of managing this household, and nursing her back to health, were ultimately priced at that exact number. She had even carefully added an NDA clause at the bottom, stating that upon receiving the money, the petitioner would voluntarily vacate the residence, forfeit any claims to further assets or equity, and refrain from damaging the respondent's reputation. I let out a dry laugh, but my throat was so choked up that it sounded more pathetic than a sob. Brenda pushed the papers closer to me, her tone nonchalant. Sign it. Don't make this awkward for everyone. Honestly, you're young. Take the money to start over. Clinging to David right now will only make us drag this through the courts, and you can't afford a legal battle. I snapped my head up. All the resentment from years of being a dedicated wife flared up to my brain like gasoline on a fire. I wanted to ask her, when she had her stroke and was stuck in a hospital bed, who stayed awake for weeks managing her care? I wanted to ask, when David's first startup failed and the debt collectors were calling, who maxed out her own credit cards and begged her family for loans to pull him back to his feet? I slammed my hands on the table, just about to open my mouth, when under the table, David's hand suddenly grasped my wrist. The squeeze was not hard, but it was enough to make me freeze. I turned to look at him. David's face was as tight as a violin string, but his eyes looked strange. They were not the eyes of a cowardly husband dodging conflict, nor did they look like a man whose heart had changed. It looked like a silent plea. Trust me. Before I could process it, David turned to his mother, his voice dropping low. Mom, let her think about it. Just that one sentence made my heart sting. Even though I knew there was something unusual in his eyes, it still hurt. In that fleeting second, I genuinely couldn't tell if my husband was protecting me or just trying to delay things so the situation would look less cruel. Brenda instantly took advantage of his hesitation. She scoffed. Think about what? The situation is clear as day. A reasonable person knows when they're out of their league. The most important thing for a woman is to know her place. Don't wait until you're thrown out on the street to realize it. My father-in-law, Robert, sat next to her, holding a cup of coffee. From the beginning to the end, he didn't say a single word. His silence was even colder than her scolding. It made me realize that this was not a decision my mother-in-law made alone. In this entire house, I was probably the last one to know. I didn't want to sit there for another second. If I stayed, I was terrified I wouldn't be able to stop myself from flipping the table and tearing those papers to shreds right in front of them. I stood up abruptly, trying to keep my voice from shaking. I'm full. You all go ahead. Saying that, I turned and walked straight into our bedroom. Behind me, Brenda's sour voice echoed. Look at that attitude. Absolutely no class. Give her one piece of constructive criticism and she throws a tantrum. I shut the door and leaned my back against the solid wood. Tears immediately spilled over. Not because I mourned this marriage, but because I pitied myself. I pitied the years I spent telling myself to bite my tongue so this family could have peace. I pitied the times I swallowed my pride, thinking she was just a difficult, old-fashioned mother-in-law. It turned out my endurance in their eyes was not kindness, but weakness. The more ground I gave, the more they trampled over me. A few minutes later, the bedroom door clicked open. David walked in and immediately locked the door behind him. I spun around, my voice choking. "What are you doing in here? If you want me to sign it too, hand me a pen. I'll sign it and be done with it." David didn't answer right away. He stepped forward, pulled me down to sit on the edge of the bed, firmly gripped both my shoulders, and said in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, "Hannah, listen to me. Don't make a scene." I looked at him, tears still hot on my face. "What does that mean? Do you really want to leave me too?" The question burst from my lips like an open wound. David instantly shook his head. He gripped my hands tighter, his eyes turning red. "No, I have never wanted to leave you. But right now, I need you to play along with me." I froze. Outside, the clinking of my mother-in-law clearing the dishes echoed through the hall, mixed with her intentionally loud voice, clearly meant for me to hear. A woman who doesn't know what league she's in will only drag a man down. Inside the room, David leaned in close, speaking every word very slowly. "Recently, my mother became close friends with a woman named Eleanor. She's incredibly wealthy, drips with country club prestige, and constantly praises my potential. Then she started finding ways to introduce her daughter, Sloane, to me." I quickly wiped my tears, my heart starting to race. David continued, "At first, I thought it was just my mother being a social climber. But everything happened way too fast. I just got promoted. I just got access to the classified project files. And they immediately forced me to get a divorce and push Sloane into my life. Don't you find that strange?" I stayed silent. The anger in my chest was still there, but a different kind of chill began to spread. David looked straight at me, his voice dropping even deeper. "I suspect they're after something else. Not a marriage." Starting the next day, I began to understand how fast a mother-in-law could flip her script once she decided to push her daughter-in-law out of the house. Brenda no longer kept any polite boundaries in front of me. Early in the morning, as I brought a pot of coffee and oatmeal to the table, she glanced at it and dropped a remark. "Eating plain oatmeal. No wonder you look so drab. A woman who doesn't know how to carry herself will eventually get left behind anyway." I didn't reply. I just quietly set the bowl in front of her. If it had been the past, I would have tried to explain or smiled it off to keep the peace. But after what David told me last night, I knew I couldn't let my emotions ruin his plan. I had to endure. Not because I was weak, but because I needed to see exactly what was hiding behind those bitter words. Brenda ate while scrolling through her phone, intentionally tilting the screen toward me. On it was a picture of a young woman in a white designer dress, her hair perfectly styled, wearing flawless makeup, standing in front of a luxury black SUV. She clicked her tongue. "Here, look at this. This is Sloane." You look at her and you see old money. Went to an Ivy League school, summers in the Hamptons, and her family owns a massive chain of high-end organic grocery stores. That is the kind of woman who belongs next to a successful executive. I held the dish towel, my hand freezing for a second. Seeing this, she felt emboldened and kept going. "I'm not trying to put you down, but facts are facts. A woman who only knows how to cook and clean can only keep a husband when he's broke. But when he moves up and enters a different tax bracket, he needs someone else." Those words felt like a direct slap to my pride. I simply replied softly, "Are you finished? May I clear the dishes?" Her face instantly darkened, but perhaps assuming I had already accepted defeat, she didn't scold me further. The most agonizing part wasn't her bragging, but the fact that David sat there in complete silence. He kept his head down, drinking his coffee, his face utterly indifferent as if he heard nothing. For a brief moment, my heart ached. Even knowing he was acting, seeing my husband stay silent while his mother degraded me still brought a wave of immense self-pity. No matter how strong a woman's logic is, her heart still has moments of frailty. That night, after the whole house was asleep, David knocked softly on my door. Because we had to pretend to be estranged in front of his mother, he didn't dare stay long. He handed me an old spare smartphone, preloaded with a few photos and a typed note. He whispered, "Look at this, but don't let my mother know." I opened it and saw a photo of Brenda sitting in an upscale coffee shop with the middle-aged woman named Eleanor and the girl from the photo this morning, Sloane. David pointed at the second photo. The man sitting at the table directly behind them is a financial analyst from Apex Foods Group. I jumped. Apex Foods Group was the biggest rival of Pure Harvest, where David worked. For years, Apex had been tailgating Pure Harvest's product lines but always fell one step behind because they lacked the core R&D formulas. David's voice grew grave. "I had a buddy run a background check. Sloane's family isn't as simple as my mother thinks. Their supermarket chain used to exclusively import products from Apex, and their corporate accounts have several transactions routed through an Apex shell company. I listened, feeling a chill wash over my entire body. It turned out this wasn't just a greedy mother-in-law wanting a rich new daughter-in-law for bragging rights at the country club. This was tied to a massive, dirty corporate war. I remembered all the traits my mother-in-law kept repeating. Ivy League educated, understands the food industry, family owns grocery stores. Things that sounded like perks suddenly formed a terrifying puzzle. David looked at me, his voice barely a breath. The project I'm running is Pure Harvest's flagship product. If the formula leaks before launch, the company could lose years of research. It's not just my job on the line. The entire supply chain, the manufacturing plants, and thousands of employees will be affected. I remained silent for a long time. Right then, I finally understood why he couldn't blow this up from the start. Without hard evidence, everything was just speculation, and the other side had clearly prepared this trap meticulously. In the days that followed, Sloan began appearing more frequently in our lives. At first, it was just gentle, polite text messages. Did David have a tiring day at work today? Then it progressed to, I heard from Brenda that you suffer from acid reflux. I'll send over some specialty herbal tea. Her tone was soft and measured, perfectly crafting the image of a sophisticated, understanding woman to anyone watching. But occasionally, she would slip in very clever questions. Once, David purposely put her on speakerphone when she called. Sloan laughed sweetly. I heard you're leading a huge project over at Pure Harvest? That must be so stressful. If you ever need someone to vent to, just tell me. I studied supply chain management at Wharton, so maybe I could actually understand a bit of it, David replied casually. Company business. It's not convenient to talk about. The other end went silent for a few seconds before she giggled. You're so cautious. But I like a man with strong principles. I sat beside him, listening with a freezing chill running down my spine. Every sentence seemed casual, but every single one was aimed directly at his work. If a woman newly introduced to a man genuinely wanted to get to know him, she would ask about his hobbies, his personality, or his family. But Sloan kept circling back to the project, his title, corporate pressure, and R&D files. That night, David turned off his phone and stood silently by the window for a long time. The streetlights cast shadows on his face, revealing the intense stress he kept hidden during the day. I asked softly, Are you sure? He turned to look at me, his eyes colder and deeper than ever. I don't want to be sure, Hannah, but all the signs point in one direction. I clenched my fists. Out in the living room, my mother-in-law's voice echoed as she called someone to brag that her son was about to upgrade his lifestyle. She had no idea what she was gloating about. She thought she was securing a spot in high society for her son, but in my eyes, she looked like a woman opening her front door, rolling out a red carpet, and inviting a pack of wolves inside. David closed the blinds. His voice was soft, but every word dropped like a heavy stone into my heart. They don't want to marry me. They want to swallow my company whole. The next morning, I did exactly as David instructed. I stopped resisting, and I didn't cry or make a scene. While Brenda was sitting in the living room drinking her coffee, I slowly walked over, placed the divorce papers from the other night in front of her, and spoke in a hoarse voice. If David truly wants this, I'll sign. I only ask that you give me a few days to pack my things. Brenda snapped her head up. A flash of undeniable joy crossed her eyes, but she quickly masked it with an air of superiority. She set her mug down and said breezily, It's good that you're being reasonable. A smart woman knows when she's out of her league. If you sign this peacefully, this family won't leave you completely empty-handed. I looked down, forcing a look of resignation, but my fingernails were digging so deeply into my palms that they ached. I thought after hearing me agree, she would soften slightly, but no. My silence only made her act even more outrageous. That very morning, she called everyone she knew. To one aunt, she said, Yes, my David is about to marry someone much more suitable. That other girl finally knew her place. To a close friend, she bragged, David is so lucky. He's finally dropping the ugly duckling to marry a swan. I stood in the kitchen, washing dishes, listening to every single word. My insides felt like they were being crushed. But I didn't walk out. I knew if I lost my temper, David's plan would be ruined. I told myself to hold on just a little longer. Let her talk. Let her think she won. People drunk on victory are always the easiest to expose. By the afternoon, Brenda returned home carrying massive shopping bags filled with brand new curtains, bed sheets, and pillowcases. She walked straight into our master bedroom, yanking open closets and rummaging through things as if I had never lived there. I stood at the doorway, frozen, watching her strip the Egyptian cotton sheets I had personally picked out when we first got married. As she pulled them off, she muttered, "This color is so tacky. When the new girl moves in, this all has to be replaced. This house needs to look like it has some actual class." I asked quietly, "Do you want me to move out of the room today?" She turned around and raised an eyebrow. "How much longer did you plan on sleeping in here? You and David are getting a divorce. Don't let people look at this house and say we lack boundaries." She pointed her finger toward the small storage room in the finished basement. "You can stay down there for the next few days. It's only temporary anyway." My throat tightened. My bedroom, the bed I had slept in for 7 years, was being prepped for another woman, while I was being shoved into a basement closet like a squatter. But I just nodded. "Yes, I'll pack my things." Seeing me so obedient made Brenda even more smug. She sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing out the new cream-colored sheets, her voice turning sickeningly sweet as she video-called Sloane. I was in the corner, folding clothes, hearing her loud, cheerful voice echoing clearly. "Sloane, honey, I'm changing the bed sheets. When you move in, I want everything to be fresh and perfectly clean. Keeping old, worn-out things just ruins the aesthetic." From the phone, Sloane's soft voice replied, "Oh, you don't have to do that. It makes me feel terrible. Hannah is still living there, after all." Her words sounded considerate, but her tone was incredibly fake. Brenda immediately waved it off. "Don't feel bad. I already consider you my daughter-in-law. My David is so talented. Now that he's a director, he's about to secure the company's most important R&D databases. Once you're by his side, his career will soar even higher." My hands stopped moving. Sloane was silent for a few seconds before laughing softly. "David is so brilliant. He must be under a lot of pressure, right? Does he ever bring those highly classified documents home to work on?" The question felt light as a breeze, but it made my blood run cold. Why would a girl being introduced for marriage immediately ask about corporate documents if she genuinely cared about her future husband? Brenda didn't notice a thing. She laughed proudly. "He trusts me completely. He tells me everything. Besides, we're all family here. What is there to hide?" Sloane replied gently. "Yes, a man doing great things truly needs an understanding support system. I just worry he takes on too much and burns himself out." I kept my head down, trying to hide my darkening eyes. It turned out they were really getting impatient. That night, I waited until my mother-in-law went to her room before sneaking back up to the kitchen. David was already standing out on the back patio. He hadn't turned on the lights and was leaning against the railing, his face hidden in the shadows. I recounted the entire video call. Every word his mother said, every question Sloane asked. I didn't skip a single syllable. When I reached the part about Sloane asking if he brought documents home, David remained silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "So they can't wait anymore." I looked at him, my heart racing. "What do you mean?" David turned to me, his gaze heavy. "This afternoon, the company detected someone trying to illegally access the research system 3 times from 3 different IP addresses. They couldn't get anything, which is why they're pivoting to me." Goosebumps erupted all over my arms. "Then let's just report this to the company right now." David shook his head. "Not enough. If we report it now, they'll just wipe their hands clean. Sloane will say she was just asking a random question. My mother will say she was just bragging. And the people pulling the strings will stay hidden in the dark." He pulled an encrypted thumb drive from his pocket and placed it into the palm of my hand. "I'm going to give them exactly what they want." I stared at him, stunned. "Are you crazy?" David looked straight into my eyes, his voice low but unshakable. "It's not the real formula. It's a decoy dataset embedded with tracking malware. If they touch it, I'll know exactly where it goes and whose hands it passes through." I looked at the thumb drive, feeling a deep chill. A massive game of chess had truly begun, and I was no longer the sidelined wife. I had become David's partner in saving our family and guarding a corporate secret that many ruthless people were desperate to steal. From the day the decoy drive was prepped, David changed his acting strategy. In front of me, he remained the quiet, stressed husband hiding too many secrets. But in front of his mother and Sloane, he began to act conflicted. It wasn't an overly eager response, but the perfectly calibrated hesitation of a man whose loyalty was being swayed by money, beauty, and constant flattery. Brenda saw this shift and couldn't hide her delight. She didn't know it was an act David intentionally put on. She truly believed her son had finally opened his eyes. Every time Sloane texted, she would urge him, reply to her nicely. She comes from a great family, she's Ivy educated, and she doesn't even mind that you've got baggage from a previous marriage. Don't act so cold and ruin your own luck. David would just hum in agreement, occasionally picking up his phone to send a short reply. But I knew every single one of those messages was screenshotted and saved into a secure folder. A few days later, David initiated a dinner date with Sloane. He told his mother in a calm voice, "Since you insist so much, I suppose seeing her again wouldn't hurt." Brenda was so thrilled she practically ran to her room to change her clothes and even carefully picked out a tie for her son. As she adjusted his collar, she glanced at me. "See? A smart woman knows when her role is over. Don't wait until he has someone else and still try to cling on." I stood nearby, keeping my head down like a defeated wife. My heart genuinely ached, but not out of jealousy toward Sloane. I hurt because I had to watch my mother-in-law personally push her son into a trap she thought was a golden ticket to high society. Right before leaving the house that night, David walked past me and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "My watch is recording." Those 4 words were all it took to calm my nerves. After their first dinner, Sloane became bolder. She sent pictures of her food, her wine glass, and a photo of her hand resting near David's coffee cup, intentionally making sure my mother-in-law saw them. Brenda was as ecstatic as if she had struck gold, bragging to every relative she knew. "My David is truly blessed. The old one knew when to step aside, and the new one is so elegant and classy." Some of my husband's relatives started throwing pitying remarks my way. Someone even came over, faking a dramatic sigh. "Hannah, well, if the spark is gone, what can you do? For a woman, saving face is what matters most." I just gave a dry smile. They pitied me. But they didn't know I was the only person in this house fully awake. The more they looked down on me, the more reason I had to stay silent until the bitter end. With every triumphant sneer from Brenda and every fake display of affection from Sloane, David gathered more evidence. He noticed Sloane deliberately steering their conversations toward his work, the R&D lab, and his habit of bringing his laptop home. Once, while dining at a restaurant, she leaned in, smiling softly. "I'm so curious. Your home office must be fascinating. A genius like you must keep so many valuable things in there," David replied vaguely. "It's just work, nothing special." But the microphone on his smartwatch caught every single word. Another night, Sloane used the excuse of bringing herbal tea for my mother-in-law. Brenda happily invited her to stay for dinner and intentionally ordered me to cook an extra dish. While everyone was chatting in the living room, I peeked through the gap in the kitchen door and saw Sloane stand up, slowly making her way toward David's home office. She didn't walk straight there. She pretended to admire the paintings in the hallway, but her eyes kept darting toward the office door. David had anticipated this. The laptop on his desk that day was rigged with monitoring software, and a fake dossier labeled Project Aurora, internal beta, was left in plain sight inside an unlocked drawer. I saw Sloane push the door open slightly, whip out her iPhone, snap several rapid photos, and return to the living room as if nothing had happened. My mother-in-law even naively praised her. "Sloane is so graceful. She walks so lightly, not like some people who stomp around looking miserable all day." Listening to her, a cold wave of pity washed over me. She had no idea the girl she was praising had just photographed documents inside her son's office. She didn't know that the gifts, the sweet talk, and the illusion of a wealthy daughter-in-law were all part of a noose slowly tightening around this family's neck. That night, after Sloane left, David checked the system. The exact moments she opened the door, photographed the documents, and stood near the laptop had all been captured by a tiny camera hidden on the bookshelf. He also showed me an alert on the software. An unknown device had attempted to pair with his computer via Bluetooth for exactly 12 seconds. I shuddered. If that laptop hadn't been a trap, she might have actually stolen something highly classified. In the following days, Pure Harvest Corp. Quietly launched an investigation. David didn't say much, but I knew the cybersecurity division was fully briefed. The decoy formulas were embedded with a digital watermark. Each file had a unique digital fingerprint. If it was copied, opened, or transmitted from another device, the system would trace its exact path. This was no longer just about our marriage. It had escalated into a psychological war, where one wrong step would bring everything crashing down. Late one night, I woke up feeling thirsty. Walking past the living room, I saw the patio door slightly ajar. David was standing out there alone, a lit cigarette glowing red between his fingers. He never smoked. Yet there were already 3 crushed cigarette butts at his feet. I stepped out and called his name softly. He startled, turning around and quickly putting out the cigarette, but the sheer exhaustion on his face was impossible to hide. I stood next to him, not blaming him, not asking questions. A long time passed before David spoke, his voice hoarse. If I miscalculate even one step this time, not only our family, but the entire company will tank. I looked at my husband, fully understanding the crushing pressure he was carrying for the first time. He wasn't just shielding me from a fake divorce. He was protecting the life's work of thousands of people and defending his own honor against a trap buried terrifyingly deep. I reached out and grabbed his hand. It was colder than I expected. "I trust you," I whispered. David turned to me, his eyes red in the dark. Perhaps from the very beginning, what he needed most wasn't a flawless plan, but someone who still stood by his side while everyone else was playing a part. Right at that moment, his phone lit up. A message from Sloan appeared on the screen. "I miss you so much. How about I come over this weekend?" Below the text was a selfie she had just taken. David zoomed in on the background of the photo. Faintly reflected on the glass window behind Sloan were the words, "Apex Foods Group." My heart felt like it stopped beating. She had finally tipped her hand. After nearly 2 weeks of living in this suffocating charade, I noticed Brenda was starting to lose her patience. During the first few days, she played the role of a generous elder, claiming she would give me time to think and pack. But seeing me quietly remain in the house, walking in and out of her sight, her annoyance became glaringly obvious. She stopped making subtle remarks and started attacking me directly. "How much longer are you going to stall? A woman who knows she's beaten should leave cleanly. Don't stick around and make a mess for the new girl." I kept my head down, folding a few old shirts into my suitcase, feeling too emotionally frozen to even argue. David went to work as usual. In front of his mother, he maintained a somber demeanor, sometimes intentionally avoiding eye contact with me, to reinforce her belief that our marriage was truly broken. I knew he was acting, but I had to admit, there were moments when his performance was so sharp it cut me deeply. Meanwhile, Brenda grew more gleeful by the day, convinced she held the winning hand. That afternoon, while I was wiping down the credenza in the living room, Brenda came home from outside. She tossed a shopping bag onto the couch and spoke like she was issuing a command. "Wear this tonight. We're hosting a dinner at the country club for David's promotion. Make sure you look decent. Don't embarrass this family one last time." I opened the bag. Inside was an old, outdated beige dress, the collar slightly frayed. I looked up at her. She smirked. "Don't look at me like that. You're about to be kicked out anyway. Be grateful I'm giving you the dignity of attending." I knew this party wasn't simple. If it was just to celebrate David's promotion, why did she organize it herself without asking him? Why had she been calling all the relatives for days, demanding they attend to witness good news? I stood silently for a few seconds, then nodded. "Okay, I understand." Seeing my submissive attitude, Brenda's smile widened, looking at me like a trapped pawn with nowhere left to run. That night, the country club banquet room was brightly lit. The moment I walked into the hall, I saw a massive LED screen above the stage flashing the words, "Congratulations, David, head of R&D." But what made me freeze was that right beneath those words, Sloane's name was listed alongside my husband's as the co-host. A picture of her was also displayed, perfectly made up, wearing a smile so gentle it was sickeningly fake. The relatives from David's side immediately started whispering when they saw me. One aunt grabbed the arm of the person next to her, intentionally speaking loud enough to be heard. "Looks like Hannah is really getting dumped. She looks like a ghost." Another woman sneered. "That's what happens when a woman doesn't make her own money. You can keep a man when he's broke, but once he moves up, you'll get replaced sooner or later." I heard every word, but I just quietly tightened my grip on my purse. If I were the woman I used to be, I probably would have burst into tears. But tonight, I knew I couldn't cry, because the more humiliated I was, the easier it would be for Brenda and Sloane to expose their true faces. David was standing near the stage, wearing a dark navy suit. His face was composed, but his eyes were restless. When he saw me, he gave a brief glance and immediately looked away, maintaining the exact distance of a husband preparing for a divorce. In that split second, my heart still stung. But I remembered the decoy flash drive. I remembered the Apex Foods Group logo reflected behind Sloane, and I told myself I had to endure this just a little longer. The party began with hollow, repetitive toasts. Everyone raised their glasses, praising David's youthful success and complimenting Brenda on raising such a brilliant son. Brenda sat at the center table, her face glowing with pride, constantly pulling Sloane to sit close to her. Sloane wore a white dress that night, radiating elegance as she spoke softly to everyone. Anyone who didn't know better would think she was a well-educated, modest girl. Only I noticed that whenever someone brought up Pure Harvest, her eyes would dart rapidly before she quickly looked down. Halfway through the dinner, Brenda suddenly stood up and took the microphone from a waiter. The chatter in the hall died down. She smiled brightly, her voice brimming with pride. Tonight, besides celebrating my David's promotion, I also want to announce a private family matter. Hearing that, a freezing chill shot down my spine. David, sitting at the adjacent table, slightly tightened his grip on the edge of the table. Brenda turned and pulled Sloane onto the stage. Sloane feigned embarrassment. "Oh, Brenda, I'm so shy." But her feet moved up the stairs remarkably fast. Brenda held Sloane's hand, smiling as if she were showing off a rare diamond. "This is Sloane, a girl I hold very dear. Her family is highly respected in the industry, and she herself is brilliant and understanding. I believe only someone like her can truly walk alongside David in the journey ahead." The entire room erupted in gasps. Several people turned to look at me with burning curiosity. Brenda then pointed directly at me, her voice rising. "As for Hannah and David, they have agreed to an amicable divorce. I hope everyone will refrain from spreading rumors. A peaceful separation is the best way to preserve everyone's dignity." I sat completely rigid. It felt like all the blood rushed to my face and then drained straight into my shoes. In front of a room full of people, she was turning me into a replaced wife, reducing my 7-year marriage to a footnote at her new daughter-in-law's debut party. But she wasn't done. Brenda opened her designer bag, pulled out the divorce papers she had prepared, and held them up like a trophy. "Since everyone is here today, Hannah, sign it now. Let's not drag this through the courts and have people say we made a scene." She said it so casually, but every word stabbed into me with agonizing pain. I stood up, my mind consumed by a single thought. I cannot let her humiliate me any further. But right at that moment, David stepped forward. He picked up a pen from the table and held it out toward me. He spoke very softly, but loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Sign it." I stood dead still for a few seconds. I could barely breathe, but as the pen touched my hand, David used his index finger to tap the table twice. That was the signal he had established beforehand. When he tapped twice, it meant the plan was in motion, and I absolutely could not react emotionally. I looked at him. David's eyes were calm, but deep inside was a suffocating tension. I understood. The big fish was about to take the bait. I looked down and signed my name on the paper, feeling the triumphant stare of my mother-in-law, witnessing the discreet smirk of Sloane, and hearing the loud whispers of the entire room. As the final stroke of the pen finished, Brenda let out a sigh of relief, as if a massive burden had been lifted. As for me, I coldly thought to myself, go ahead and smile, because from this exact second, the real game begins. After the dinner party that night, everything in the house completely changed. If Brenda had previously maintained a thin veneer of morality, from the moment I signed that paper in front of our relatives, she abandoned all pretense. She treated me like a ghost about to vanish, while Sloane was openly treated as the new lady of the house. The next morning, Brenda called a contractor to measure the living room for new curtains. She spoke loudly on purpose. "We have a new person moving in soon. Anything old and unlucky needs to be thrown out." I heard every word perfectly but quietly continued washing dishes in the kitchen. Sloane sat in the living room, her voice as sweet as honey. "You really don't have to do that. I feel bad. Hannah is still here." Brenda immediately waved it off. "You're just too sweet. That's why you think like that. Once a person signs the papers, they're an outsider. Don't let it bother you." The word outsider felt incredibly light, yet it stung my chest. 7 years in this house, and I was brushed aside that fast. That night, Brenda insisted Sloane stay over. Her reasoning sounded perfectly logical. "It's late. It's dangerous to drive back to the city alone. Stay here for the night, and tomorrow morning I'll have David drop you off at work." After saying that, she turned to me, her tone icy. "As for you, your things are mostly packed. Go sleep in the basement. The guest room upstairs is for our guest." I looked at the basement storage room. It was a space previously used to store cardboard boxes, mops, and random junk. Brenda had someone throw a thin mattress on the floor, and the room still carried the faint smell of damp wood. I didn't say anything. I just hugged my pillow and walked down. As the door clicked shut, I heard her voice echoing from the hallway. See? Things are so much easier when people know their place. As night fell, the house became heavy with silence. I lay on the thin mattress, my eyes wide open, staring at the low, dark ceiling. Cold air seeped through the crack under the door, but it was nothing compared to the smoldering humiliation in my chest. I told myself to endure it, just a little longer. David had warned me that something might happen tonight. If Sloane was truly impatient, she wouldn't wait. Around 1 a.m., when the whole house seemed fast asleep, I suddenly heard a very faint noise in the hallway. It wasn't the HVAC, and it wasn't an object falling. It was the sound of footsteps, intentionally placed softly, slow and steady. I immediately sat up, holding my breath to listen. Through the narrow gap in the door, I saw a pale, white figure glide by. It was Sloane. She was wearing a cream-colored silk pajama set, her hair cascading down her shoulders, her face entirely devoid of makeup, yet she maintained a bizarrely calm demeanor. What sent a chill down my spine was that she was wearing thin latex gloves. A woman walking around someone else's house in the middle of the night wearing latex gloves is absolutely not a coincidence. I quickly grabbed my phone and texted David. She's out, heading toward the home office. Less than 10 seconds later, my screen lit up. David replied with one single sentence. Don't go out. Let her do it. I gripped the phone tightly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would echo in the dark. Through the door gap, I watched Sloane stop in front of David's office. She glanced around quickly before pulling a tiny thumb drive from the pocket of her pajamas. The office door was unlocked. David had purposely arranged that. Sloane pushed the door open and stepped inside, her movements sharp and decisive, completely different from her usual gentle persona. The faint blue light from the laptop screen illuminated her face. I couldn't see everything inside, but I saw her lean closely over the desk and plug the drive into the machine. Seconds later, her fingers flew across the keyboard. The Project Aurora decoy folder David had prepared was sitting right on the desktop. She opened it, selected all the files, and began copying them. Right at that moment, the sound of a bedroom door opening echoed from the end of the hallway. I jumped. My mother-in-law had woken up, probably to use the restroom. She was muttering to herself, her slippers dragging loudly against the hardwood floor. Inside the office, Sloane panicked. Before she could yank the drive out, Brenda was already standing in the doorway. I thought everything was ruined. If Brenda caught her, Sloane could just make up an excuse, and David might not get the hard evidence he needed. But Sloane's reaction speed was terrifying. She rushed over and threw her arms around Brenda, tears instantly spilling from her eyes as if rehearsed. Oh, Brenda, I'm so sorry. I couldn't sleep. I miss David so much, I just wanted to come in and see where he works, to look at his photos. Brenda froze for a few seconds before her suspicion entirely melted away. She patted Sloane's back, her voice full of pity. Oh, you poor sweet girl. Do you really love my David that much? You are such a loyal and loving woman. Saying that, she turned sharply toward the basement door where I was staying, and raised her voice on purpose. Some people can be a wife for 7 years and still not know how to love their husband as much as you do. She should look at you and learn what a real partner looks like. Standing behind the door, I felt both furious and disgusted. Sloane wiped her tears, keeping her head bowed like a fragile girl overcome by love. But I knew the gloved hand hidden in her palm was still tightly gripping that thumb drive. This woman wasn't just deceitful, she was an incredibly skilled actor. One fake tear from her could blind my mother-in-law more effectively than the most expensive gifts. Brenda walked Sloane back to her room, not forgetting to throw a few more insults my way before shutting the door. The hallway fell silent again. I looked at my phone screen, my hands still shaking. David sent another text. Done. Data copied. It was a short sentence, but I knew the most crucial phase had just begun. What Sloane had stolen wasn't the real formula. It was a decoy dataset embedded with Pure Harvest tracking malware. The moment that drive was plugged into another device, the system would log the IP address, timestamps, and network routing. She thought she had just won a massive payout, but in reality, she had just triggered the trap David had meticulously set. The next morning, while I was brewing coffee in the kitchen, David walked in from outside. He didn't say anything in front of his mother, but simply placed his phone on the table just as the screen lit up. A corporate internal alert displayed clearly, Project Aurora data accessed at 3. 17 a.m. via Apex Foods Group proxy server. I stared at those words, my heart hammering. The wolf hadn't just entered the house. It had left muddy footprints all over the floor. That morning, before the tracking notification could even fade from David's screen, another crisis hit faster than we expected. He had just changed his shirt to head to the office when his phone rang nonstop. On the other end was Jason, the head of data security at Pure Harvest, sounding so panicked he was practically out of breath. David, get to the office right now. The R&D system is on total lockdown. Project Aurora has been breached. I stood in the kitchen, still holding the dish towel, feeling my stomach drop. David didn't put the phone on speaker, but the color drained from his face. He asked sharply, "How bad is the leak?" There was a pause before Jason replied, "The worst. A copy of the dataset just pinged inside Apex Foods servers. The board of directors is losing their minds. The last access log is tied directly to your credentials." Brenda was sitting in the living room drinking coffee. Hearing fragments of leak, Apex, and credentials, she immediately shot up from her chair. She asked in a panic, "What's going on? What happened to the company? Tell me right now." David just grabbed his jacket, his voice turning ice cold. "I have to get to the office." Brenda ran after him. "But what about you and Sloan? Her family was supposed to meet us today to finalize things." He didn't answer, just opened the door and walked straight out. As the door clicked shut, Brenda snapped her head toward me. The triumphant look she had worn for days was gone, replaced by a mix of terror and rage. "This is your fault, isn't it? Ever since you started walking around with that miserable face, nothing but bad luck has hit this house. You saw David getting a better life, so you cursed him, didn't you?" I looked at her, my heart turning cold. Even at a time like this, she wasn't worried that her son might be in serious trouble with federal authorities. The first thing she did was look for a scapegoat. I didn't want to argue. I just replied, "You should be worrying about David right now." But that response only made her more furious. She pointed her finger right at my face, her voice trembling. "Don't act so self-righteous. If something happens to David, I'll make you pay." Right at that moment, Sloan walked down the stairs. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, looking like she had been ready for hours. She rushed over to support Brenda, her voice choking up. "Oh, Brenda, please calm down." I believe David would never do something like that. Her words sounded supportive, but her eyes shot a rapid, calculating glance in my direction. In that single look, I knew she was perfectly playing the role of the devoted, worried partner. Brenda grabbed Sloane's hand like a drowning woman clinging to a life preserver. "Sloan, you have to believe him. My son would never sell out his company." Sloan lowered her head, her voice as soft as water. "I believe him. But a data leak this massive. The company will investigate ruthlessly. You shouldn't let outsiders use this opportunity to make David even more stressed." Outsiders. She said it so lightly, but the knife was pointed straight at me. I looked at the two of them, one blinded by country club ambition, the other faking innocence while her heart was full of poison. In that moment, I could only pray that David had calculated deep enough. Otherwise, he would be swallowed alive by his own trap. The news began to spread within Pure Harvest. A few old colleagues who knew David texted me, pretending to check in but clearly fishing for gossip. One even sent a screenshot of a company Slack channel, where words leaped off the screen. I heard the data leaked from the new director's account. Selling formulas right after a promotion? Guess he needed cash for the new country club wife. With every line I read, my hands grew colder. David's name was being dragged through the mud in a single morning. He came home late that afternoon. His dress shirt was rumpled, his face haggard, his lips dry and cracked. Brenda rushed to him first. "What happened? Is it a misunderstanding? Did you explain everything?" David loosened his tie, his voice raspy. "I've been suspended. The R&D system is on lockdown. Internal Affairs is running a 7-day investigation." Brenda staggered backward and almost collapsed into a chair. But seconds later, she turned to me again, needing a target for her panic. "This is all because of you. If you had just left quietly, this house would be at peace. You hovered around like a dark cloud, and now you've ruined him." Before I could speak, David snapped, "Mom, shut up." The room went dead silent. This was the first time in years he had ever yelled at his mother. Brenda was stunned. Sloan, standing next to her, quickly squeezed out a few tears. "David, she's just worried about you." David looked at Sloan for a split second, his gaze so intense she slightly flinched. But then he just said, "I'm exhausted. Leave me alone." He walked straight upstairs. That night, a heavy, suffocating atmosphere draped over the house. Brenda locked herself in her room, crying and calling relatives. Sloane stayed very late, continuously comforting her, even saying, "If David is being framed, my family's lawyers will help prove his innocence." Hearing that made me want to laugh. The person holding the knife was playing the medic. Around midnight, when the lights were out, I quietly went to the backyard, following David's text. He was standing under the pergola, his silhouette noticeably thinner. Before I could ask anything, he handed me another phone. On the screen was the hidden camera footage from his office. Sloane was clearly visible. From the moment she walked in wearing gloves, to plugging in the drive, to copying the files, I let out a sigh of relief, but David didn't look relaxed at all. He said, "This is just the tip of the iceberg. The company suspects Apex Foods had an inside man at Pure Harvest all along. I used my own credentials as bait to draw them out." I froze. "You bet yourself on this?" David gave a bitter, exhausted smile. "If I didn't take the risk, the entire company, thousands of people would go down. Our real product hasn't even launched. If public trust collapses now, Pure Harvest will never recover." I looked at him, my throat tight. "What if they don't believe you? What if you actually get fired?" David remained silent for a few seconds before answering very softly. "Then I lose everything, but at least I know I tried to protect what mattered." I grabbed his hand, feeling both angry and heartbroken. Before I could say another word, he pressed play on the video again, slowing it down to a specific frame behind Sloane. At the edge of the office door, a figure was standing half hidden in the shadows. The person quickly made a hand signal and retreated into the dark. At first, I thought it was just a reflection, but when David zoomed in, my blood ran cold. Even though only a fraction of the face was visible, I instantly recognized that dark brown jacket. It was the jacket my father-in-law, Robert, wore every single time he went out at night. I turned to David. His face was pale, his eyes red, but his voice was terrifyingly calm. "I just found this out too. The person who unlocked the door for Sloane that night wasn't my mother." David's words left me standing paralyzed under the pergola. The face of my quiet, gentle father-in-law flashed through my mind. Robert had always been the most silent person in this house. Whatever Brenda said, he just agreed. I always thought he was passive, afraid of his wife. I never imagined he could be secretly orchestrating this. David rewound the footage one more time. This time, the image was clearer. Right before Sloane stepped into the office, a hand reached out from the hallway and handed her a small key. The person immediately shrank back into the shadows. The brown jacket, the slightly hunched posture, the old silver ring on the ring finger. There was no mistaking it. It was Robert. I had to grip the railing to stay standing. "How could Dad do something like this?" I asked. But I knew David couldn't give me an answer. He stared at the screen, his lips pressed so tight they were white. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice cracking. "I suspected someone inside the house was helping them. But I never thought it was Dad. I really never thought it was him." The next morning, David didn't immediately go to the office. He used his suspension as an excuse to stay home, but in reality, he was secretly investigating the family's bank accounts. He didn't alert his mother, nor did he confront his father just yet. I sat next to him in the small basement room, watching the numbers appear on his screen, my heart growing heavier by the minute. There were multiple deposits made into Robert's account over the past 3 months. Individually, they weren't massive, but combined, they totaled over $300,000. David kept tracing the money trail. Some transfers came from unknown personal accounts. Others routed through small consulting firms. But his friend in cybersecurity confirmed that those accounts were linked to a shell company owned by Apex Foods. It made my skin crawl. They didn't just approach Sloane. They didn't just exploit my mother-in-law's greed. They had sunk a deep hook into my father-in-law. By the afternoon, David received a file from a contact at a bank. When he opened it, he sat completely motionless. I peeked over and saw bank statements linking to an offshore sports betting ring. Robert had been wiring money there for nearly a year. It started with a few $100s, then thousands. The amounts grew staggeringly large. There was one night he lost over $50,000 betting on college football. I suddenly remembered all the times cash went missing around the house. Brenda always blamed the housekeeper for stealing. I also remembered the nights Robert would sit alone on the patio, gripping his phone, his face flushing red and then turning pale. Back then, I just thought he was reading the news. It turned out that behind his silence was a massive pit of debt swallowing our entire family. David placed the papers on the table, clasping his hands tightly. $300,000, he whispered. He owes them over $300,000. I was stunned. For a normal family, $300,000 is a devastating amount. For a man currently suspended from his job like David, it was practically a death sentence. I asked, "Does Mom know?" He shook his head. She only knows he's been irritable lately, but she definitely doesn't know he owes this much. All the puzzle pieces finally snapped together. My father-in-law was drowning in gambling debt and being extorted by bookies. Right at that moment, Apex Foods approached him, promising to pay off his debt if he helped Sloan get close to David. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law, blinded by greed and vanity, willingly rolled out the red carpet. One person sold his soul for debt, the other shut her eyes for greed. Both of them, in their own ways, were pushing their own son off a cliff. That evening, Robert came home later than usual. As soon as he walked in, he saw David waiting in the living room. On the coffee table lay the bank statements and the printed screenshots from the security camera. Brenda thought her son was about to discuss the divorce, so she walked out looking pleased. But when she saw David's face, she froze. The air in the house was as thick as the calm before a hurricane. David tossed the photo of the hand passing the key onto the table, his voice raspy. "Dad, explain this." Robert looked at the photo, and the color instantly drained from his face. He opened his mouth several times but couldn't form a sentence. Brenda stepped forward, frowning. "What is this? What is going on with you two?" No one answered her. David slid the bank statements across the table. "How much do you owe them?" Robert collapsed onto the sofa. The man I always saw as silent and conflict avoidant was now trembling like a child caught in a lie. He stuttered, I just wanted to borrow a little to cover it. They said they only needed me to help Sloan get into the house a few times. They promised it wouldn't hurt you. They said they only wanted to look at the files, that they wouldn't make a big deal out of it." David let out a laugh, but it sounded more agonizing than a sob. "Wouldn't hurt me? You gave the key to my office to an outsider. You let them steal corporate data. Do you know I could go to federal prison for this?" Robert grabbed his head, his voice breaking. "I was backed into a corner. They came to the house when you weren't here. They threatened to break my legs if I didn't pay. I was terrified your mother would find out. I was terrified of losing my dignity for the rest of my life." Brenda finally understood what was happening. She turned to her husband, her eyes wide with horror. "What did you say? You owe money to bookies? And you teamed up with outsiders to ruin your own son?" Robert didn't dare look at her. He just kept his head down, tears hitting the table. David stood up, his voice so cold it made me shiver. "From now on, never say you did anything for this family. Someone who cares about their family doesn't use their own child as a sacrificial lamb." But the tragedy didn't end in that living room. That very night, Apex Foods suddenly announced they were launching their new product line ahead of schedule. The news flooded financial websites, using incredibly malicious headlines. Pure Harvest in crisis over corporate espionage. R&D director suspended after formula leak. David's name was dragged through the mud everywhere. Someone even leaked a photo of him from the promotion party to mock him, saying he fell from grace the second he peaked. The next morning, Pure Harvest's stock tanked. David's phone rang endlessly. Colleagues, executives, reporters, and unknown numbers called one after another. He turned off his phone and sat blankly at the dining table, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. Brenda was completely frantic. She had lost all her arrogance. She paced back and forth in the living room, muttering, "It can't be. Sloan's family will help David. They have lawyers. She really loves him." Right on cue, Sloan arrived. She was wearing a light blue dress, her makeup subtle, carrying a basket of fruit. The moment she saw Brenda, she ran over and held her, her voice choking up. "Oh, Brenda, I heard the news and I was so worried. Please don't break down. I won't abandon David during a time like this." Brenda clung to her like a drowning person catching a lifeline, even dropping to her knees. "Sloan, I beg you, please don't leave David. Right now, your family's connections are the only thing that can save him." Standing on the staircase, I watched the scene, my chest tight with a mix of anger and pity. The mother-in-law who once forced me to sign divorce papers, who called me an outsider, who brought another woman into my home to replace me, was now kneeling at the feet of the exact person destroying her son. Sloan quickly helped her up, continuously saying, "Please don't do this. It breaks my heart." But when Brenda turned her face away to wipe her tears, I saw very clearly that Sloane looked down and fired off a rapid text on her iPhone. David, standing behind me, saw it too. The text on her screen flashed for just a second, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The fish took the bait. A week later, Apex Foods hosted a massive live stream to launch their new product. Since early morning, the internet had been flooded with their ads. They boasted about breakthrough technology, a formula that destroys Pure Harvest, and a new era for organic food. David's name was subtly dragged through articles, painting him as the traitor who caused Pure Harvest's downfall, while Apex triumphantly claimed the crown. That evening, David came home very early. He didn't say much. He just quietly turned on the smart TV in the living room and switched it to Apex's live stream. On the screen, their stage was brightly lit, backed by a massive logo. The host, dressed in an expensive suit, used such flowery corporate buzzwords, it sounded incredibly fake. The live viewer count was skyrocketing, the numbers jumping rapidly, which made my mother-in-law pace nervously. When she saw Sloane sitting in the front row of the VIP section, Brenda let out a sigh of relief as if she had seen a savior. She glanced at me and spoke with a bitter edge. Look at her, and learn. When this family is in trouble, Sloane is still standing right there. Still elegant, still strong. She might be the one to actually bail David out. I didn't answer. If this was a few weeks ago, that comment would have suffocated me with pain. But now, watching her desperately cling to the delusion of a wealthy, perfect daughter-in-law, I just felt a very strange sensation. Not quite anger, not quite pity. It felt like watching someone blindly walk into an abyss while convincing themselves they were stepping on a red carpet. David sat on the couch across from her, his fingers interlaced, his eyes locked on the screen. I knew he was waiting for the exact moment. Since the night he found out about his father, he had barely slept. The dark circles under his eyes were deep, his face visibly thinner, but his eyes tonight were no longer wavering. They were cold and sharp, like someone who had set all the explosives and was just waiting to hit the detonator. On the screen, the Apex host began introducing the new product. They called it Next Gen Clean Food. They claimed it used a proprietary formula that preserves natural flavors without synthetic preservatives. Those words sounded terrifyingly familiar, because they were almost identical to what Pure Harvest had planned to announce. Hearing this, Brenda panicked and turned to David. Why does this sound exactly like your project? David, why are they saying the same things? David just replied softly, keep watching, Mom. A few minutes later, the chief technical officer of Apex walked onto the stage and began projecting the formula schematics. They were so arrogant, they magnified every compound on the massive LED screen, bragging while explaining the science. But that exact arrogance is what killed them. Less than 5 minutes later, the comment section of the live stream exploded. An account claiming to be an FDA food science expert commented, "The stabilization ratios here are completely wrong. Combining this with organic enzymes at high heat creates toxic byproducts." Immediately, a flood of other comments poured in. This formula is flawed. Did Apex even test this before going public? This looks more like a failed beta test than a commercial formula. Is anyone else seeing a massive health hazard here? The host's face on the screen noticeably stiffened. The CTO began stumbling over his words. Below the stage, Sloane could no longer maintain her calm smile. She looked down at her phone repeatedly, her face draining of color. Brenda, sitting in front of the TV, started trembling, her hand shaking so hard the glass of water she held spilled. How? How is this possible? Right while Apex was frantically trying to do damage control, the official Pure Harvest page dropped a press release. David picked up the remote and switched to a secondary monitor where the statement was displayed clearly. The formula currently being presented by Apex Foods Group is a decoy dataset created to assist in an FBI investigation regarding corporate espionage and unauthorized network intrusion. The living room went dead silent. The glass of water slipped from Brenda's hand and shattered on the hardwood floor. Her jaw dropped. She stared blankly at the screen. On the live stream, the chat was moving so fast it was unreadable. Viewers skyrocketed as a relentless wave of criticism, SEC violation questions, and mockery rained down on Apex. At the exact same time, a short video clip was released by Pure Harvest to investigators and the press. In the video, Sloane was clearly seen inside David's home office, wearing gloves, plugging in a flash drive, and copying files. On the event broadcast, Sloane suddenly shot up from her seat. She tried to slip away toward the backstage area, but two plainclothes FBI agents immediately blocked her path. Because the media cameras were broadcasting live, every single second was captured. Sloane tried to yank her arm away, screaming in a shrill, panicked voice. "You have the wrong person! It wasn't just me! I was following orders!" The audience gasped in shock. Security guards rushed in to hold her. Sloane was so hysterical she completely dropped her innocent act. She turned directly toward the cameras, her face distorted in sheer terror. "Robert took the money. He gave me the key. I couldn't have gotten into that room without him." I heard my mother-in-law let out a gasp, like someone had just crushed her windpipe. She slowly turned her head to look at Robert. He was sitting in the corner armchair, his face entirely bloodless, his lips quivering uncontrollably. She stammered, You really sold out your own son?" No one answered her. Robert's silence was the clearest answer of all. David sat completely still, but I could see his eyes were bloodshot. Outsiders might look at this and think he had won, but I knew how agonizing this victory was. To drag the truth into the light, he had to watch his mother act out of blind country club greed, watch his father betray him, and watch himself get publicly dragged through the mud. He wasn't gloating. He was just quietly enduring a wound that might never fully heal. Outside, it started to rain, the sound of the drops hitting the patio growing heavier. Inside the living room, Brenda collapsed onto the floor. She clutched her head, muttering over and over, "It's impossible! It's impossible!" Robert broke down sobbing. It was the hollow, raspy cry of a man who knew he had nowhere left to run. About half an hour later, the doorbell rang. David stood up to open it. Outside, standing in the pouring rain, were two federal investigators. One of them held up a badge, his voice deep but clear. "We need Mr. Robert to come with us for questioning regarding the theft of corporate trade secrets from Pure Harvest Corp." Brenda looked up, her face streaked with tears. Robert silently stood up, his legs shaking. As he walked past David, he called out softly, "David," but my husband didn't look at him. He just stepped aside. The door stood wide open, the freezing wind and rain whipping inside, washing away the pathetic illusion of wealth and status that my mother-in-law had so desperately tried to drag into this house. After that rainy night, the entire suburban neighborhood seemed wide awake. The moment the police cruiser pulled away, the doors of nearby houses cracked open. People peeked through their blinds. Some pretended to take out the trash just to stare at our yard. The house Brenda once endlessly bragged about as the perfect family had instantly become the center of neighborhood gossip. Overnight, the pride she had fiercely guarded for years shattered into pieces, just like the glass of water she dropped in front of the TV. By the next morning, the video of Sloane being detained at the Apex product launch had gone viral. The clip of her hysterically screaming Robert's name was clipped, edited, and shared everywhere. People even dug up the video from David's country club promotion party the moment Brenda held Sloane's hand and proudly announced her as the worthy woman for her son. The compliments that had once made her swell with pride were now serving as the internet's most brutal punchline. Brenda's phone rang constantly. Some called out of nosy curiosity. Some called to check in. But many called purely to mock her. I stood in the kitchen and heard the voice of one of David's aunts blaring through the speakerphone. "Oh, Brenda, honestly, being a social climber is a curse. You didn't appreciate a dedicated wife like Hannah who stayed by his side for years, and instead, you brought in a snake that destroyed your own house." Brenda couldn't say a single word back. Her hands trembled as she hung up the phone. For the first time, I saw my mother-in-law completely collapse on the living room floor without an ounce of her former arrogance. Her hair was a mess, her lips cracked, her face as pale as someone recovering from a severe illness. She looked at David with eyes full of fear and desperation, stammering, "David, was she really playing me? Did Sloane? Did she not love you at all?" David stood in front of his mother, his face stripped of anger, leaving only extreme exhaustion. He didn't answer immediately. He pulled a stack of photos from his briefcase and dropped them onto the table. They were FBI surveillance photos of Robert sitting in a secluded diner across from a strange man. One photo showed him accepting a thick manila envelope. Another showed him signing a document. And one was clear enough to show his guilt-ridden, bowed head. Brenda trembled violently, her panic rising with every photo she saw. David spoke softly. "Dad took money from Apex Foods. Over $300, routed through multiple accounts to pay off his bookies. Did you think they gave you designer bags and showered you with country club invites because they respected you? They calculated everything. They knew you were obsessed with status. They knew Dad was drowning in gambling debt. They knew I was just promoted and had clearance to the classified project. The phone in Brenda's hand slipped and hit the sofa. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. I stood nearby, my heart heavy. There were moments when I wished karma would hit her, that she would hurt the way she made me hurt. But seeing her sitting there, blindsided by her own greed, I didn't feel any satisfaction. I just felt a suffocating sense of bitterness. But the hardest blow was yet to come. David unlocked his phone and played an audio file that corporate security had just recovered from Sloane's devices. There were a few seconds of static, and then Sloane's voice came through crystal clear. But it was sharp, cold, and dripping with disdain, completely different from her usual sweet tone. That tacky old boomer, Brenda, is so easy to string along. You just throw a designer bag at her, flatter her son a little, and she practically paves the road for us herself. A man's voice on the other end laughed loudly. Just let her dream about having an heiress for a daughter-in-law. Once we get the formula, we dump the whole family. Once David gets fired, what value does that house even have? Hearing that, Brenda clutched her chest, gasping for air. Her eyes bulged, and tears streamed down uncontrollably. She violently shook her head, muttering, "No, no, that's not right." She called me Mom so sweetly. She said her family's lawyers would take care of David. David turned off the recording. The room was dead silent, save for the sound of Brenda's broken, jagged sobbing. Suddenly, she lunged toward the nearby wall like a madwoman. "I ruined my son! I ruined him!" I jumped and ran over to pull her back. David stood frozen for a few seconds before stepping forward to grab her wrists. She thrashed around, her face smeared with tears and makeup, bearing no resemblance to the fierce mother-in-law who once pointed her finger and forced me to sign divorce papers in front of our relatives. But David didn't hug her like he used to. He just held her firmly to stop her from hurting herself, then slowly let go. His voice was so cold it made my heart ache for him. "Do you know what hurts me the most, Mom? It isn't that Sloane conned me. It isn't that Apex tried to destroy me. When competitors attack you, you can at least defend yourself. The people who hurt me the most were my own family." Brenda froze as if she had been slapped. She looked at David, then suddenly turned to me. In that split second, I saw clear shame, terror, and total despair in her eyes. She stumbled forward and dropped to her knees right in front of me. She grabbed the hem of my shirt, her voice hoarse. "Hannah, I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please save our family. Talk to David. Beg him to help me. Don't let his father go to federal prison. Don't let this house fall apart." I stood completely still, my throat locked tight. The woman who once called me out of her son's league, who shoved me into a basement storage room, who brought in someone else to replace me, was now kneeling at my feet, begging me to save her family. I didn't know whether to help her up or let her kneel just a little longer so she could truly absorb the weight of what she had caused. Finally, I reached down, peeling her fingers off my shirt one by one, and said softly, "Mom, there are some things I cannot save. The law isn't a country club seating chart you can just rearrange when it suits you." Brenda wailed out loud. David turned his face away, his shoulders tense. Right at that moment, David's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and his expression instantly shifted. The person on the other end spoke rapidly. I only caught fragments. "Headquarters. Board of Directors. CEO subpoenaed by the SEC." David hung up, looked at me for a split second, and said quietly, "Hannah, I have to get to the company right now. Something massive just happened at Pure Harvest." I didn't even have time to change clothes. I grabbed my coat from behind the door and followed David to the car. Outside, the rain hadn't fully stopped. The roads were slick, the streetlights stretching into long, cold yellow streaks across the wet pavement. David drove fast, but his hands on the steering wheel were unnervingly calm. I sat in the passenger seat, looking at his profile, feeling a mix of fear and anxiety. The chaos in our home hadn't even settled, and now Pure Harvest was facing another crisis. When the car pulled up to the corporate headquarters, I saw security guards swarming the entrance. Part of the building was locked down, and the employee elevators were temporarily disabled. In the lobby, men in dark suits were talking intently with the legal team. The tension was suffocating. The remaining employees stood in small groups, their faces pale, whispering anxiously. A receptionist saw David, froze for a second, and immediately looked down to avoid his gaze. I followed my husband into the main boardroom on the 12th floor. As the doors opened, the smell of stale coffee, paper, and raw tension hit me. Inside, the board of directors was almost entirely assembled. Several major shareholders glared at David with thinly veiled hostility. At the head of the table, the CEO's chair was empty. I heard someone mention that the CEO had just been subpoenaed by the SEC to answer questions about market manipulation and insider trading linked to the data leak. A silver-haired man shot up from his chair, slamming a file onto the table. "David, the company is on fire. The CEO is pulled in. Our stock is tanking, and the press is swarming the gates. You're the head of R&D. You bear the primary responsibility for this." Another executive immediately chimed in. "If the data didn't leak from your account, none of this would be happening. Are you planning to drag all of Pure Harvest down with you?" Listening to them, I was shaking with anger. The man who stayed awake for weeks setting a trap to catch a corporate spy, the man trying to save the company from espionage, was now being thrown under the bus by his own board. I wanted to step forward and defend him, but David gently put a hand up to stop me. He stood tall in the middle of the boardroom, his dress shirt still damp from the rain, his face pale, but his eyes incredibly steady. A female shareholder spoke sharply. "In my opinion, we need to terminate David immediately and announce to the press that this was the action of a rogue employee. The company must amputate the infected limb to survive." Her words sent a chill down my spine. They didn't care about the truth. They just needed a scapegoat to throw to the media mob. David let out a faint smile, though there was no joy in it. He pulled out a chair, sat down, opened his MacBook, and spoke slowly. "Did you really think I didn't prepare for this?" The entire boardroom fell dead silent. David connected his laptop to the main projector. A massive, detailed timeline appeared on the screen. Starting from the day he was promoted, he presented every single milestone. The day his mother met Eleanor, the day Sloan appeared, the day Apex attempted to hack the system, the exact night Sloan plugged the flash drive into his laptop, and the precise second the decoy data pinged the Apex proxy server. Every single event was backed by photos, IP logs, network routing traces, and sworn affidavits from the cybersecurity team. One board member stuttered, You've been tracking them this whole time?" David looked at him, his voice flat. "Not tracking. A coordinated internal sting operation. I filed a classified report with data security before this even blew up. Every step has a logged case file with the FBI." He clicked a button, and encrypted emails filled the screen. The timestamps showed they were sent to the head of cybersecurity and the chief legal counsel. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted. The executives who were screaming for his head just seconds ago clamped their mouths shut. But David wasn't done. He said, "Sloan and Apex Foods are just the tip of the iceberg. If someone inside Pure Harvest hadn't paved the way, they wouldn't have known what stage Project Aurora was in. They wouldn't have known I was just granted security clearance, and they certainly wouldn't have known the exact moment to leak the story to crash our stock." The screen transitioned to a complex web of financial transactions. Red arrows connected an internal Pure Harvest executive account to a third-party consulting firm, which then looped back to a private offshore account. When the final name appeared on the screen, it felt like all the oxygen was sucked out of the room. Vice President Richard Sterling, the man sitting on the right side of the table, who had maintained a posture of righteous authority the entire meeting, suddenly went rigid. David stared directly at him. "Mr. Sterling approved my emergency security clearance 3 days early. He was also the one who drafted the press release blaming me as a rogue employee before the investigation even concluded. And, conveniently, his brother-in-law's brokerage account heavily shorted Pure Harvest stock while buying massive call options on Apex Foods right before their product launch." Sterling slammed his hands on the table and stood up. His face beet red. "You're framing me! You set me up!" David didn't flinch. He pressed one last button. An audio recording played over the boardroom speakers. It was a phone call between Sterling and an Apex executive. Sterling's voice was unmistakable. "Let David take the fall. When he's fired, the R&D seat opens up. I'll handle the media on this end." The boardroom was paralyzed. The silver-haired man who had cursed at David earlier was now staring at his shoes, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Right then, the boardroom doors swung open. 2 federal agents walked in, flanked by the company's legal counsel. Sterling spun around, the color draining from his face, turning from red to a ghostly white. He took a step back, then suddenly pointed at David and screamed, "He made this all up! He's trying to steal the company!" But no one believed him anymore. A federal agent spoke calmly. "Richard Sterling, you are under arrest for corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and market manipulation." As the handcuffs clicked around Sterling's wrists, I saw David's shoulders slightly tremble. Not out of fear, but because the crushing weight he had been carrying finally had somewhere to drop. But just before Sterling was let out the door, he turned his head back. His face was twisted in pure hatred. He glared at David and snarled, "You think you won? If I go down, Pure Harvest goes down with me. I already sent something out. You won't be able to stop it." Those words dropped into the boardroom like a live grenade. The executives who had just sighed in relief instantly turned pale again. David stood perfectly still, his eyes darkening. In that moment, I realized the storm wasn't over. It had just changed direction. And this time, it wasn't just my husband's reputation on the line, it was the survival of the entire company. Sterling's final threat left the boardroom suffocating in silence. Even after he was hauled away, the shadow of his words hung heavily over everyone. David immediately coordinated with the legal and cybersecurity teams to initiate a full system sweep. I stood in the hallway, looking through the glass walls, as my husband paced between glowing monitors, his face ashen, yet his eyes maintaining a fierce focus. It wasn't until early morning that David finally walked out. He told me they hadn't found any real data transferred out of the system, but the court of public opinion wasn't waiting for a verdict. In just a few hours, the narrative on social media had violently shifted. People stopped attacking Apex and started questioning David. A viral article on a major business news site titled Times Hero or Mastermind was spreading like wildfire. Below it were thousands of comments. Some accused him of staging the entire sting just to fast-track himself to the C-suite. Others argued that no R&D director is innocent when their credentials are used in a breach. I read the comments, my hands shaking. One person wrote, "Don't think a video clears his name. Maybe the husband and wife staged this whole drama to pass the buck." An even more vicious comment read, "Wife gets forced into a divorce. Husband in a corporate scandal. Father-in-law owes bookies. That family is just pure toxic trash." I locked my phone, but the words burned into my retinas. The public only needed 3 seconds to judge us, while we had spent a month living in terror to drag the truth into the light. By the afternoon, things escalated. Someone drove past our house and hurled a bucket of red paint at our front gate. The paint dripped down the iron bars like blood. Taped to the brick pillar was a hastily scribbled note. "Don't play games with consumer lives." I stood in the driveway looking at it, my blood running cold. Brenda looked down from a second-story window. Seeing the red paint, she stumbled backward, clutching her chest, gasping for air. Ever since the night Robert was taken by the FBI, Brenda had completely unraveled. She lost her arrogance, stopped bragging on the phone, and never mentioned Sloane's name again. She locked herself in her room, the curtains drawn tight. There were days I brought a tray of food up and left it by her door, only to find it untouched hours later. I could occasionally hear her muffled cries. It wasn't the cry of someone seeking forgiveness, but the sound of someone who had personally smashed her own life to pieces and had no idea how to put it back together. David tried to stay strong. He met with corporate lawyers, coordinated with the company, answered federal investigators' questions, and then came home acting as if he was fine. But I saw it all. He was losing weight rapidly. His dress shirts hung loosely on his shoulders. At night, he wouldn't sleep. He would sit in front of his laptop, reading reports and scrolling through the endless attacks against him. Once, I snatched his phone away, and he just gave me a tired smile. "I have to know what they're saying, so I know how to defend us." One night, I woke up and found his side of the bed empty. I went downstairs and found David sitting alone in the dark kitchen. In front of him was a glass of bourbon, more than half empty. The security lights from the backyard cast long shadows across his exhausted face. I stood at the doorway, hesitating. It wasn't until he poured himself another glass that I stepped forward and gently held his wrist. David looked up, his eyes bloodshot. He let out a raspy laugh, his voice rough like sandpaper. "Maybe I really am not cut out to be the good guy, Hannah. I try to save the company, and I get accused of staging it. I try to protect my family, and my dad gets investigated. My mom is having a breakdown. And you get dragged out as a joke in front of our relatives because of me." I sat down next to him. After a month of playing the role of the estranged wife, I finally pulled my husband into a tight embrace. No signals, no plans, no acting. Just me and the man who was entirely broken from carrying too much for too long. I whispered, "You didn't do anything wrong by doing the right thing. It's just that people haven't seen the whole truth yet." David didn't reply, but his arms wrapped around my back, holding me fiercely. I felt his shoulders shake. "There are some men who don't cry out loud. but their pain is so heavy that one simple embrace is enough to make them shatter. The next morning, I went upstairs to bring Brenda some oatmeal, but found her door slightly ajar and the room empty. On her vanity, the drawers were pulled out, and her document lockbox was wide open and empty. I felt a knot in my stomach. I looked around and realized the black tote bag she always carried was gone too. Then, a crumpled piece of paper on the floor caught my eye. It was a photocopy of our house deed. I picked it up, my heart racing. Right next to it was a torn piece of paper with a phone number and a scribbled note. $300K up front, the rest when it's done. I instantly realized what she was doing. Brenda was trying to take out a shady second mortgage on the only house we had left to pay off fixers to save Robert. But what terrified me was the initials signed at the bottom of the note. Sterling's guys. Richard Sterling had been arrested, but his enforcers were still on the street. If my mother-in-law actually handed them money, not only would it not save Robert, but it would drag our entire family into a federal obstruction of justice charge. I ran downstairs just as David walked in from the garage. Seeing my face, he knew something was wrong. I handed him the paper. David read it, and his expression turned to stone. He called his mother repeatedly, but it just rang out. A few minutes later, the phone was turned off completely. He stood in the middle of the living room in dead silence. I saw a horrifying internal war in his eyes. On one side was his own mother. On the other, the absolute final line of law and morality. I whispered, "You have to stop her." David closed his eyes, his voice cracking. I know. When he opened his eyes again, the pain in them was so deep I couldn't bear to look. If she goes through with this, I'll have to turn her in myself. Just as he said that, a car sped past our gate. A neighbor ran over, looking panicked. "Hannah, I just saw your mother-in-law get into an Uber carrying a massive bag." She looked frantic. I called out to her, but she didn't even turn around. I looked at David. He grabbed his car keys and sprinted out the door. But it was too late. Brenda was gone, taking the house deed and whatever shred of sanity she had left with her. For the entire morning, the house felt devoid of oxygen. David called her countless times, but her phone either rang endlessly or went straight to voicemail. I called every relative we knew, but no one had seen her. The neighbor only vaguely remembered the Uber turning toward the highway. David drove around to every notary public, every shady payday loan office, and every place his mother frequented. But everywhere he went, he hit a dead end. By noon, he returned home. His shirt was soaked in sweat, his face gray with exhaustion. I poured him a glass of water, but he just held it, staring intensely at his phone as if looking away for a second would cause the world to end. Around 3:00 p.m., David's phone suddenly vibrated. An unknown number sent a 20-second video. The moment he opened it, my blood turned to ice. In the video, Brenda was tied to a plastic chair. Her hair was a mess, a rag stuffed in her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer terror. The wall behind her was stained yellow, illuminated by cheap, flashing neon lights. A raspy male voice spoke from off-camera. "You want your mother back? Get $500,000 in cash. No cops, or you can come collect her body." I covered my mouth, my heart pounding so hard my chest physically ached. No matter how horribly Brenda had treated me, seeing her in that state made me sick to my stomach. David turned pale. He immediately called the number back, but the automated voice said the subscriber could not be reached. He shot up from his chair, ready to bolt out the door. I grabbed his arm. "We need to call the police." He didn't answer. He just replayed the video. The first time, he looked at his mother. The second time, he looked at the room. But on the third time, he froze, his eyes narrowing. He scrubbed the video back a few seconds and pressed the phone to his ear. I thought he was panicking, but a moment later, he muttered, "This isn't right." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" David pointed at the screen. "Listen closely. There's a commercial playing in the background. I know that jingle." I held my breath and listened. Beneath the kidnapper's threat, faintly bleeding through the audio, was the sound of a cheap PA system. The Starlight Lounge. Best drinks, best times. Right off the West Side Highway. David looked up, his eyes bloodshot, but his voice dead certain. If these were real kidnappers, they wouldn't be stupid enough to film a ransom video in a place blasting a radio ad that gives away their exact location. He immediately called the federal investigator handling Robert's case and forwarded the video and the suspected location. Less than half an hour later, we arrived near the West Side Highway alongside two plainclothes officers. The area was a run-down industrial strip. Dive bars, motels, and neon signs flickered under a gloomy gray sky. The Starlight Lounge sat in a narrow alley, its front window covered in opaque tint. When the officers demanded entry, the manager stammered, claiming no one named Brenda was there. But David spotted his mother's black tote bag sitting behind the bar. He pointed at it, his voice icy. "That is my mother's bag." The manager went pale. An officer signaled his partner, and they moved toward the stairs. We followed behind, my heart hammering against my ribs. On the second floor, from a room at the end of the hall, we heard laughter and the clinking of glasses. It didn't sound anything like a kidnapping. An officer kicked the door open, and the scene inside left me completely paralyzed. Brenda wasn't tied up. She was sitting comfortably on a leather sofa. In front of her was an open bottle of liquor, and beside her sat 3 heavily tattooed men. One of them was the exact bookie who had extorted Robert. In the corner of the room sat the plastic chair, the rope, and the rag from the video. The moment Brenda saw David, the color drained entirely from her face. The glass in her hand dropped to the carpet, the dark liquor spreading like a blood stain. David stood in the doorway. He didn't speak, but his silence made the room drop 10 degrees. One of the men stood up, forcing a nervous laugh. "Hey, just a misunderstanding, man." She came to us and asked for a favor. Before he could finish his sentence, the officers had him against the wall. Another guy threw his hands up, stammering. "We were just doing what she paid us to do. She told us to make a ransom video to scare her son into giving her corporate money. We didn't hurt her." I turned to look at my mother-in-law. She was shaking, her lips moving, but no sound came out. David stepped into the room slowly. His voice was completely shattered. "Mom, tell me you didn't stage this yourself." Brenda burst into tears, sliding off the sofa and grabbing her son's pants leg. "I had no other choice. If your father goes to federal prison, this family is ruined. I just wanted to scare you so you would dip into the corporate funds to save him. I know how smart you are. I knew you could find a way to cover it up." That sentence was the final drop that made David snap. He yanked his leg away and roared, his voice tearing through the stench of liquor and smoke. "You want to destroy my life to be satisfied? Is that it? Dad sold me out, and now you want me to commit federal wire fraud to save him?" His scream silenced the entire room. I had never seen David like this. The man who was always patient, always calm, was now standing over his own mother, his eyes burning with absolute devastation. Brenda froze. Perhaps this was the very first time she truly saw that she had pushed her own son over the absolute edge. She collapsed onto the filthy floor, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. But this time, David didn't help her up. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes staring blankly into nothing. The police quickly confiscated the phones, the ropes, and the original video, detaining the enforcers. Brenda was ordered to come down to the precinct to give a full statement. As she was escorted out the door, she looked back at David, her voice trembling. "David, Mom was wrong." But David didn't answer. He turned his face away, his fists clenched tight. I stood next to him, my heart feeling like lead. Brenda hadn't lost her son on paper, but from that exact second, she had lost the very last shred of trust he ever had for her. 3 months later, everything finally came to a close. Apex Foods Group was placed under federal investigation for corporate espionage, unauthorized network intrusion, and market manipulation. The executives pulling the strings were indicted one by one. Sloan, the girl who walked into my house with an Ivy League smile and honeyed words, received federal prison time for her direct role in stealing the data. Because Robert fully cooperated with the FBI and testified against the syndicate, he received a suspended sentence. But his reputation and dignity were entirely destroyed. From that day on, Brenda fell ill. It wasn't a terminal disease, but it was as if all the life had been drained out of her. She barely spoke. She stopped criticizing, stopped raising her voice, and stopped calling relatives to brag. On some afternoons, I would see her sitting by the window for hours, staring out at the empty yard, her fingers picking at the hem of her shirt, as if searching for something that had slipped through her fingers forever. One rainy afternoon, she called me into her room. The room was darker than usual, the curtains only pulled halfway. She sat propped up against the pillows on her bed, her face noticeably gaunt. When I walked in, she stayed silent for a long time. Then with shaking hands, she pulled open her nightstand drawer and took out an old wooden jewelry box. She placed it in my hands, her voice raspy. "I'm giving this back to you." I opened the box, and my throat tightened. Inside was all my heirloom jewelry, the vintage diamond stud earrings my grandmother gave me, the platinum locket, and the diamond tennis bracelet I thought she had pawned off years ago to pay David's startup debts. It turned out she had kept them all this time. I stared at the jewelry resting on the faded velvet. I didn't know why, but my eyes started to burn. Brenda began to cry. Not the loud, dramatic wailing from before, but soft, exhausted sobs. She whispered, "I used to think that as long as we were rich, this family would be happy. I thought that if my son had money and power, he needed a wife that made him look impressive at the country club." I was so stupid, Hannah. It wasn't until I lost everything that I realized who was actually real. I stood in silence, the wooden box feeling impossibly heavy in my hands. There are some apologies that come too late to erase the past, but there are also moments when you just don't have the energy to hold on to the hatred anymore. I looked at the woman who had once suffocated me with pain. Now, she was just a frail, regretful, and incredibly lonely old woman. I didn't hate her like I used to. I just felt my heart grow tired, and then, a little softer. That night, as David sat out on the deck, I told him about the wooden box. He was quiet for a long time. The night breeze rustled the curtains behind us. I looked at him and finally asked the question I had kept inside for months. Why didn't you just tell me everything from the very beginning? David looked down, his hands clasped together. After a long pause, he answered, "Because I wasn't sure I was going to win." His voice was very soft, but it carried the weight of months of suppressed terror. He said, "If the plan failed, I would have lost my job, my honor, and my family. Worse, I could have gone to prison as the scapegoat for the entire syndicate, because all the digital footprints pointed straight at me." Hearing that, tears spilled down my face. During that entire time, I only thought about how I had to endure, how humiliated I was, how hard it was to play the abandoned wife. I didn't realize David was walking on a tightrope, knowing that one wrong step meant plunging into the abyss. I hugged my husband, crying like a child. For the first time, I fully understood why he needed me to trust him so desperately. David gently patted my back and let out a soft laugh. When Mom forced the divorce, the thing I was most terrified of wasn't losing the company. I looked up at him. He squeezed my hand, his eyes red. "It was that you wouldn't believe me." A month later, we moved out of the big house. Not out of anger, and not because we were cutting them off completely, but because we both knew we needed our own space to start over. Our new apartment was small. Just one bedroom, a kitchen barely big enough for a 4-person table, and a balcony overlooking the trees below. There was no massive suburban mansion, no bragging, and no more suffocating, heavy dinners. On moving day, I placed the wooden jewelry box on the shelf, right next to a vase of yellow daisies. David looked at me and asked if I wanted to lock it in a safe. I shook my head. There are some things we don't need to lock away anymore. We had walked through a massive, endless storm. We lost things, we got hurt, but in the end, we still had each other's hands to hold. That night, I cooked a very simple dinner, just a side salad, some grilled chicken, and a bowl of mac and cheese. David sat across from me, serving me a piece of chicken just like he did when we were first married. I looked at the small dinner table, looked at the man sitting in front of me, and suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of peace. It turns out, a family doesn't need to be filthy rich, incredibly fancy, or impressive to the outside world. As long as, during the most violent storms, there is someone who still believes in you and stays by your side, that is more than enough to keep you warm.